In this video, we're going to talk about the basics of Bible translation, particularly as it relates to English translations of the Bible. We're going to introduce two different translation philosophies, so-called formal equivalence philosophy, which is more concerned with a one-to-one correspondence between the ancient words and the modern words, and a functional equivalence translation, which is more like a paraphrase and is more concerned with a correlation between the ideas in the text, the ancient text, and the ideas in the modern text. We're going to talk about how every translation, is an interpretation of the biblical text, and it's also a representation of the Bible that's related to other representations, to other translations, and other versions of the Bible. Finally, we're going to end our time by thinking about how comparison of translation is valuable for appreciating each representation of the Bible, but also for understanding the text in an interpretive context. When we talk about translation, we're talking about two different poles. On the one hand, you have the pole of the ancient language, Hebrew and Aramaic when it comes to the Old Testament, and Greek when it comes to the New Testament, and the pole of the modern or target language, in our case, English. And so interpreters have to have a thorough understanding of both the original languages. They need to know the vocabulary, the grammar, the style of the ancient languages, but they also need to know all of that when it comes to the target language. They need to understand how English grammar and style and rhetoric works in order to translate the style, the rhetoric of the ancient language into the target language. And this makes translation both a science and an art. Translation is not simply a matter of taking each individual word, finding its corresponding word in English, and sort of just mathematically transferring that over, because oftentimes words work together. Individual words constitute phrases, which constitute sentences, which constitute paragraphs, which constitute entire discourses. So they're always working together, and an individual word is doing more than just meaning what that single word means. It's doing something within the company of all of those other words. All that to say, there is still a sense in which we can think of the two translation philosophies that we're going to introduce in just a moment here, being more, trending more to being sort of scientific presentations or mathematical presentations of the text, and the other philosophy being more artistic presentation of the text. And so it's important to note that every translation is an interpretation, that translators bring themselves to the act of translating, because translators are holding what is in the ancient text in their head, and they're producing something new in the target language. They're always bringing sort of a piece of themselves to the product that they are creating. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but simply, in my opinion, a thing that needs to be recognized and in many cases celebrated. And it gets even more complicated when we recognize that it's not just one individual bringing their thought and mind to the product, but it's usually, when it comes to English translation, a whole group of people bringing their thoughts and themselves to the act of translation, because most translations are done by committee. They're done by a group of people that usually have some ideological or theological connections to one another. And so they're bringing those ideological and those theological values to their translation of the text. And again, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but the result is that we find that certain English translations, tend to have more ideological and theological resonances with different denominational groups who have different ideologies. So we tend to think of something like the NIV or the ESV being more associated with sort of more conservative and evangelical circles, whereas something like the NRSV is oftentimes associated with more mainline groups and mainline denominations. So there are three basic kinds of translations, and the first one of these is the kind that is most often done by committee. So most English translations today are committee products, but this first type in particular is most often a committee committee product, if not always a committee product. And these are revisions of previous English translations. So you think of something like the New Revised Standard Version or the New Revised Standard Version updated edition. That new and the updated edition bit is because they are revisions of an older English translation that had come before it from a different committee. And sometimes the history of the committee, you have people that have stayed on that committee over the course of the years or over the course of the updates. So that's the first kind of translation. Less commonly, you get wholly new or wholly fresh translations, where an individual or a group embarks on taking the Hebrew, the Aramaic, and the Greek and creating something wholly new that's not sort of genealogically related to English translations that have come before it. And then the last group is the kind that's most often done by single individuals. And these are imitations of antique style or translations that bring their own sort of style to a text in a really self-conscious kind of way, that they're trying to do something particular with their English style. And one of the most common things that these translations will do is try to imitate the antique style of the text, to sort of be concerned with how the Hebrew is poetic in certain ways and bring out that poetry in a way that doesn't necessarily or doesn't always reflect English artistic sensibilities, but might more sort of reflect Greek, the artistic sensibilities of the Greek language or the Hebrew language. And the last thing to note here is that every translation is a representation of the Bible. Again, every translation is creating a product that is experienced by other individuals who most likely have already had encounters with different translations and with different and the Bible in a variety of different media, whether it be audiobook, whether it be film. And so every new translation sort of enters into this network of representations of the biblical text and is something that can be experienced on its own right, in its own right as sort of a scientific and artistic product, but can also be experienced alongside and in sort of connection to the other representations of the biblical text that exist within its wider network. There are two main translation philosophies. The first is the more word-for-word philosophy, what is called formal equivalence translations, which really try to bring out the similarity between the original language and the target language in a sort of one-to-one kind of way. So in this way, formal equivalence translations are willing to sacrifice the clarity of ideas in order for a one-to-one correspondence to be maintained between the word in the Greek, the Hebrew, or the Aramaic, and the word in the English. On the other side of the spectrum are functional equivalence translations, which are more willing to sacrifice that one-to-one correspondence so that the basic idea of a phrase, a sentence, or even a couple of sentences is maintained. So a formal equivalence translation is going to be more focused on the minutia, on each individual word, where functional equivalence translations are going to take in phrases and entire sentences and try and think about how that whole phrase or how that whole sentence might be best construed in English without respect to how each individual word matches the Greek word to which it is related. And because every translation is a representation of the biblical text that is related to others in its network and others that are available to individuals, I don't think it's necessarily the case that formal equivalence translations or functional equivalence translations are better than the other. Rather, there are advantages and disadvantages to both translation philosophies. On the side of advantages for formal equivalence translations, they'll often let the ambiguities of a Greek or Hebrew issue stand. If there's some grammatical sort of debate about what the grammar means, the formal equivalence translations are okay letting that sort of ambiguity stand, and they don't smooth it out, which allows the reader to decide sort of on their own what the text means. Perhaps the greatest advantage to formal equivalence translations is that they are very, very consistent in how they translate individual Greek or Hebrew words. So they're always going to translate the Greek word dikaios as justice. Every time that word dikaios appears in Greek, they're going to translate it the same way, even if it has a different shade of meaning, so that you know every time you see the word justice, it's that word dikaios in Greek. So there's a high degree of consistency in how individual words are translated. And lastly, formal equivalence translations are going to maintain ancient imagery. So oftentimes they sort of have a Bible-ness to them, or a Bible-y air about them, because they are not going to change the ancient imagery. They're going to let that correspondence stand, even if it's not necessarily imagery that we use in the modern world. So a good example of this is how the Hebrew Bible will call the Israelites a stiff-necked people. A formal equivalence translation is more likely to keep something like that, where a functional equivalence translation is going to say, what's a better modern metaphor or modern phrase for that? On the positives of functional equivalence translations, they don't pretend to be objective. They sort of admit from the outset that they are doing interpretation, and this gives them more artistic freedom to do things like be more elegant and exciting with their English prose and with their English artistic sensibilities. Part and parcel of this is interpretive decisions are often made very clear. In functional equivalence translations, you can often see exactly where it is that the translation stands on a particular interpretive debate. When it comes to the negatives of these two different translation philosophies, formal equivalence translations, as scientists and mathematicians, apologies to the scientists and mathematicians among us, because they're so objective and rigid, they can be a little bit sort of awkward and boring. That they sort of just kind of drone on in a sort of scientific or mathematical way. And they also tend to give the illusion that translation is not an interpretation, that they're sort of just presenting the biblical text as it is in the Hebrew or the Greek, whereas even though there is a sense in which they are just doing a one-to-one correspondence, it's impossible to sort of check oneself completely at the door when creating a translation. And those bits of oneself, the interpretation is always going to make its way into the translation. On the negative for functional equivalence translations, they very often smooth out ambiguities. They sort of don't let the ambiguity stand. So you might not know that there is a particular interpretive debate around a grammatical issue when reading a functional equivalence translation. The functional equivalence translations are also going to substitute biblical imagery with modern imagery. Sometimes this works really well and in a really beautiful way, but sometimes the Bible-y air, the Bible-ness of the language is sort of lost in a functional equivalence translation. And finally, and perhaps most detrimental or most damning to functional equivalence translations, or the biggest drawback to them, is that they will translate individual Greek or Hebrew words a variety of different ways. So a Greek word dikaios might be translated justice in one place and like ethics in another way. And it could be, 5 to 10 different ways that one individual word is being translated. So when you come across those different words in English, you wouldn't necessarily know that they all come from the same Greek or Hebrew word. And this is what a spectrum of formal equivalence to functional equivalence looks like. So on the one hand, we have word-for-word translations. Something like the NASB and the ESB are going to be quite a bit more formal. They're going to have a one-to-one correspondence between the word in Greek and the word in English. And then on the other side of this spectrum, we have something like the Message. It is going to take in much larger chunks of information, whole phrases, whole sentences, even sometimes several verses at a time. Think about what those mean in Greek and Hebrew and try and sort of translate that larger chunk, that larger idea into something that makes best sense in English. Because this is a spectrum, of course, you have things in the middle. Things like the NIV and the Jerusalem Bible are going to be a bit more sort sort of moderate in their approach, not being really strictly word for word and not being really strictly idea for idea, but standing right in the middle there. And so the general advice that you'll hear from most people is that formal equivalence is best for studying, for doing interpretation, whereas functional equivalence is best for appreciation or sort of for personal edification. I think that's probably generally good advice, but at the end of the day, because we have access to all kinds of different translations, the best modus operandi, in my opinion, is to be able to do comparison and be able to sort of celebrate the virtues of different translations at different times. So this could be doing a direct comparison of translations at any given time, putting several different translations up there, and if you have learned the biblical languages, also comparing them to what's going on in the Hebrew, the Aramaic, or the Greek. But even if you don't know the biblical languages, being able to compare how different English translations render the Hebrew and the Greek in different kinds of ways can be really illuminating. And you can do this kind of comparison, putting the text up there and doing direct comparison very easily with digital tools today, things like Step Bible or Bible Gateway. But even better, in my opinion, is when studying a particular passage, is to make a comparison of them sort of line by line, verse by verse, or side by side, and printing that out to be able to mark it up. And it really helps you notice different kinds of differences. The way that there are similarities and differences between the text oftentimes helps you see the text in a new kind of way. It's a way of sort of turning over the biblical text to see and appreciate new things about it. So this is one way of doing it, doing direct comparison. The other way of doing it is taking in each individual presentation at a time, holding up the message, reading an entire passage, reading an entire chapter from the message, and then turning to another translation, another representation of the text, and engaging that particular one, and noticing what it is that you sort of think, feel, and notice while engaging each individual version at length. So comparison can happen in a couple of different ways: direct comparison and comparison with a little bit more distance.